We're waiting on a video issue right now, but while we're waiting, we have one projector working, so if you're on this half of the room, you're in good shape. If you're on that half of the room, you get to look at the blue screen of the projector. So I'm Patrick Arlt, and this is Ala from Blah. We both work on the ArcGIS for Developers website. If you want to grab the link to these slides, they're up there. We'll show them again at the end. But just to kind of get a sense of who's here, since we've got a pretty good room, who in this room would actually call themselves a designer as your primary job? 1 in the back, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Who here would call themselves a programmer kind of as their primary application? And keep your hand up if you're a programmer who's been asked to design something. Okay. I think we're going to get started so we don't run out of time. If you want to, on this half of the room where the projector's down, if you want to grab the short link, it's bit.ly/2, capital C, capital D, capital F, lowercase v, 3, uppercase B. So if you want to grab the link, you can follow along on the slides on that half of the room. And we'll flip back. Hopefully they'll get that working before the talk ends at some point. So, yeah, it's bit.ly/2, capital C, capital D, capital F, lowercase v, 3, capital B. All right, so let's get started. So I kind of quizzed everyone as to who actually considered themselves a designer versus who's kind of been a programmer who has been asked to design something at some point or another, or someone who is responsible for the design. And I do that because when we kind of talk about design, actually refresh this and see if I can pick up the new version of these. There's lots of different kinds of design, and there's specialized design disciplines just like there's lots of specialized programming definitions. You could be a mobile programmer or back-end or front-end. You could be a web developer. But there's also lots of different kinds of design. So some of the ones you'll commonly hear, you're someone who's designing user experiences, you're designing user interfaces. Someone who's doing graphics, they're just concerning themselves with designing graphics that are used on pages. Someone who's doing things like web design, who's just designing actual web pages. But the two that most people seem to be interested in now, especially when we're working with applications and kind of programming related design, are user experience and user interface. And the two overlap. If you imagine a Venn diagram, they're overlapping a little, and they have a strong correlation with one another, but they're really quite different. So the user experience design is kind of the sum of the whole. How do all of the pieces of your application interact with each other? How do users interact with your application on a whole? And the user interface is the actual specific parts and pieces. What do the design of the buttons look like? Are they clear? Is the font right? They have a strong correlation, but people tend to kind of conflate the two of them with one another. And generally, especially on a small team, where if you're at the stage where you're a programmer who's being asked to think about design, you're probably doing a lot of it. Because on a bigger team, you're going to have someone to fill each of those roles. You're going to have people who do user interface, you're going to have people who do graphics, you're going to have people who do web, and you would just be able to sit back and program, but you're here, so that clearly isn't the case. So what is design? That had an extra bit on mine. So design isn't necessarily about how things look. Design is actually about how things function. If you're designing a backend for a web application, there's an aspect of design and determining how that backend functions. Design applies to more than just visual design, and it applies to more than just the disciplines I just talked about. But design is how it works. So when you talk about design in terms of an application, design is really how your application works. But it's not how it works in a programming technical implementation sense. It's how does it work for the user. And that's very different from how does it look. So when we talk about good design is something that meets the criteria. There's always apps that need to do things. There's a reason we're building the things that we're building. And if it doesn't actually meet those criteria, it probably has a fairly poor design. And similar to that, does the design achieve the objectives? If an objective of the design was to get users to sign up, if no one signs up, it hasn't met its objective, so it probably isn't very good. It doesn't have as good of a design. And it actually needs to function. So there could be things where it could meet its criteria. The user needs to be able to click on a feature and see all of the attributes on a feature, and that could be one of the criteria of the application. But if you bury that under another 2 or 3 interactions, that doesn't function well for the user. So it's possible to do the first 2 and still not necessarily have a good design because you haven't thought about how that works as a function of your application. And lastly, are your users actually happy? Do people actually enjoy using your application, or do they like using it enough that they don't kind of existentially dread touching it like I do for things like PowerPoint? So if we're looking at kind of good design is more about asking the correct set of questions than actually making anything look good. And some of those questions could really include things like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What does our application need to do? What are the things that are essential for it to function? And asking things like, who is it designed for? Who are our users? Are our users experienced users who are going to be very technically capable and we're going to be able to train them? Or are our users just kind of a general audience that we can't train, we can't give them any sort of, we can't talk to them, we can't give them any sort of information ahead of time, they just kind of appear on this application. What is our application supposed to do? Does it need pop-ups? Does it need panels? Does it even need a map? Does it need these different functionalities? That'll start informing you as to what are the different pieces of the design that you absolutely need. And then, were users able to accomplish their task? Were they able to interact with your design and actually discover the tools that they needed to do their job or to help accomplish the function that the application was supposed to do? So design is really about asking the correct questions at the beginning of the process and less about the end of the process and making something kind of, oh, it's got some design at the very end, and we'll do that. Design starts at the beginning before you even begin building the application. And if you end up with a bad design, you either didn't ask the right questions at the beginning, or you failed to answer your own questions. So if one of the criteria was, well, it has to present the information in a very simple way, and you presented the information as a really dense, complex table, you didn't address the question of, we need to present this in a simple way. So let's take a look at something that I think is actually very well designed. Craigslist. So my wife and I bought a house and we had to sell our old couch because it didn't fit in our living room, and I ended up just going with Craigslist because that's kind of the default, and I was actually really pleasantly surprised to see that it still looked like this. And the reason is because Craigslist is actually kind of amazing. It still looks like this after I don't even know how many years, but there's a couple reasons that it looks like it does. There's really only 2 things you want to do when you want to go to Craigslist. You want to find something to buy, or you want to sell something. Can anyone find anything else that isn't related to one of those 2 functions on this page at all? The entire page is related, except for maybe, avoid scams and fraud and privacy policy. That's so minor on the page. The entire site is focused on you need to find something to buy or you need to sell something. And it's very focused. It doesn't look pretty, but it's actually incredibly easy to navigate. Search is fairly clear. It's clear there's the different categories that I can go to. I know what I can interact with. And it accomplishes its goal. And when I was doing some research for this talk, someone else made a good point. The quality of the Craigslist website doesn't give you any assumptions about the quality of things that you're going to find on Craigslist. Which we chuckle at until you realize that that's actually pretty smart. If this was really, really fancy, we might expect to find really fancy stuff, not my $60 couch. So let's take a look at kind of the opposite of this. When we bought our new couch, this was the website that the guy who was selling it was using. I'm actually really not interested in unpaired black and brown work boots for whatever reason, or in this V-Star motorcycle, but most of the page is giving me stuff that I don't need. I don't need 90% of what's on this page. How long did it take someone to find the search bar on this page? Can you even see it? You can barely see it, but it's that big gray bar up at the top. It's really difficult to actually find what I wanted, which was, I just want to look for a new couch. The sell your stuff link is pretty obvious, but this page has a lot of visual conflict. So even though it looks better than Craigslist at first glance, there might actually be more issues with it because they've kind of overstuffed the visual design of the page. So let's take a look at some basic kind of fundamentals of design. And this is, I went to school for art, which is a little funny. So this is actually some of the stuff that I managed to pick up. Which is kind of applying. So when you start the design process, you usually start with a project that you're working on, or you start with kind of a question that you really want an answer on. And from that, you can generate the requirements that the design needs to accomplish. So you've got lots of criteria that it needs to do. The app needs to do X, Y, and Z. And from there, you can actually start designing. And by designing, I mean you're usually going to start with wireframes. And wireframes are a great way to just kind of get the initial thoughts out. And I'll show some that we've done for the developer site. From the wireframes, it's usually you progress into prototyping. And there's a lot of ways to do that, and that kind of covers a lot of ground, so I want to get into that next. But for wireframes are really, really low fidelity. If you think about the amount of communication that's in a wireframe, something like this. This is the wireframe for the new homepage on the developer site. This is in my sketchbook and photographed with my phone and then posted on our internal GitHub repo as the starting point of the design of the new homepage that you saw in the plenary. As an issue. Yeah, as an issue in GitHub. This is literally what I gave to the guy who kind of does our front-end development. It was like, look, it should probably look something like this. This seems like, if this seems weird to you, it really shouldn't be, because almost all of our designs kind of start out like that. It's very, very low fidelity. There's not a lot of detail in there. And the reason there's not a lot of detail is that actually helps clearly communicate what the design is trying to do. It answers our basic questions. When we set out to redesign the homepage, we had a set of goals that we wanted, and the wireframe shows how we wanted to address those goals. It kind of gave you the basic layout of the page and some of the workflows, and it's a really fast way to get those communicated across. So it's a good starting point. And I'll do anywhere from maybe 6 to 8 different variations on something like this per design. It's cheaper to do this than it is to update your code because you made a mistake at this point. So I super encourage you, if you're interested in becoming better at design, get a sketchbook. Don't fuss around with apps or anything. Just go get anything does it. I'm still using pens that I had in college as an art student. Like it's not fussy. And you can take a photograph of it on your phone, and then you can share that with your team. And it actually helps organize your ideas, and you'll identify problems faster at this stage trying to answer your own questions. So once you kind of get an idea of the wireframe, right, like that looked roughly pretty decent. So we started playing around with various prototypes, and the prototypes have slightly more detail. You kind of add the details as you go along in this process. And it's usually we bring in some functionality at this point. We sometimes start on the HTML and the CSS at this point, just kind of flesh out the rough proportions of everything. And you start to identify the specific interactions and the specific workflows that you really want to accomplish. And there's a lot of different ways to make prototypes, and there's a lot of variation in going from a kind of just basic wireframes to prototypes. Some people still do prototypes on pen and paper. My favorite one is drawing out the individual components on paper, cutting them out, and then just shuffling them around on a board. We've done it where we just draw out different pieces of the UI on Post-it notes and stick them up around a whiteboard, and people move them around the whiteboard until it works. There's also various drawing apps. There's apps that are specific to prototyping, things like Axure and Balsamiq that are more complicated, but they produce something that may be interactive. It may be a higher level of detail. This is also where HTML and CSS prototypes can come in really handy. Don't worry about the JavaScript. Just put in a placeholder. Just take a screenshot of a map from somewhere and drop it in, and mess around with the stuff that surrounds your application. Is this correct? Is this the right layout? How would a user find the functionality that we're trying to add? So from the prototyping phase, because we usually prototype in HTML and CSS because we've got the developer's website and it's already set up, it's easier to just prototype in there, and we end up refining that into the final product. And that's when we bring in graphics. We usually bring in the final icons. We do the final passes on typography. We do animations if it's necessary. This is where most of the development work of the design happens. But at this point, it's filling in the details rather than determining the details. And we ended up, I think, at a pretty good place because this is the new homepage, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback on it. And some of the things that we were trying to achieve with this is we wanted to really clean up the appearance of the page. It was a lot of the things that we were promoting on the page were actually, we found, were confusing people rather than actually helping them find what we need. And we wanted to also elevate the prominence of the new feature pages that we'd been working on, which were buried a few clicks down. So we ended up removing some of the elements that we found in testing were confusing, like having a giant button that says build apps on the homepage that doesn't actually tell you anything about building apps. And we swapped it for elements that we knew were working. So a lot of that was determined, but you can see the similarities between the final design and the initial sketch. There are some differences, and we ironed out most of the differences during the prototyping phase, and we refined the prototype until we actually ended up with the final product. So I want to talk about some of the visual design principles, because a lot of this does seem like it's related to visual design, and that's something that people care about a lot. And there's some very basic principles that you can kind of use to inform work as you go along. So the first one being contrast. And the contrast between two colors helps create visual separation. So a lot of that's foreground, background. Elements that have generally the same amount of contrast tend to not stick out. So like these gray pins on a gray map. And you can use that to your advantage if that's your goal. If you want one thing to stand out more than another, making it significantly lighter or darker or brighter actually helps elements stand out. But if you have information that's secondary, it helps to actually recede that into the background more, give it less contrast, and you can actually use that to control where your user's attention goes. This is why action buttons in applications are usually very colorful, because we want to draw users' attention to them. So if there's a specific workflow that you want to emphasize in your application, making that workflow stand out more by making it contrast can help that stand out as a starting point where you want users to begin at. So lastly, the second principle would be repetition. And this is one that we use a lot on the site because we want you to be able to find where you're going. We want to allow you to find your own path through the site. There's actually 4 different ways to get to the JavaScript API from the homepage through, I think, 3 or 4 different paths of clicking and searching. And that's completely intentional. And we say, people ask us, well, there's 2 links to it. Why do you need 2 links? And I say, well, why don't we need 2 links? If people want to find the JavaScript API, they might not hit the one button that we have on the homepage. Maybe they go to the documentation page first, and then they progress to the JavaScript API homepage. So there's adding multiple pathways can actually be really helpful. And this is things like using both tooltips and pop-ups instead of using them exclusively. Or what if we have filtering that works on the map and the list? So when I filter, if I type in a search query, if it filters a list view and a map view. So there's a lot of different things here, but generally it's worth thinking about, can we add in other ways of accomplishing the same task in a way that's intuitive and in a place that it's where a user might expect it to be. So the next one's area. And area is really about the larger things should generally be the most important things. It's not actually worth it to use up a ton of space in your application for something that doesn't really matter. And inversely, the lack of something in certain areas of your application can emphasize that there are aspects in other areas. For example, search. This is the default search widget from the JavaScript API on the bottom, but a custom styled one at the top would really emphasize that this application is about searching. So depending on what your application's doing, think about customizing some of the default components to emphasize the areas that you want users to interact with. If an application's about drawing or adding features, make those larger than the controls that are searching for features. Emphasize the areas of functionality you want users to work with. And the last principle I'd really want to talk about is proximity. Group things together logically tends to work better than just grouping things arbitrarily. I see this a lot where the zoom and the search are completely at separate areas of the map, and that is fine if you have a reason for search to be there, but if you don't have a reason, it's generally better to group it by the other controls. And this is also true because users tend to work through pages in the same direction we read, which is left to right. So they'll encounter the search button first, as opposed to encountering the search button last. So I'm going to flip it over to Al, and he'll take you through a little design exercise using some of those.
All right, thanks, Pat. So that kind of steps you through some design principles that we actually exercised for building the website. And then we're going to take a look at some mapping apps and so forth that we also built into there. But for right now, I think part of the principle and part of the objective today is to show you guys some good design practice from the UI and the UX side of things. So we'll start with this little exercise. So this is a paragraph. It's a simple paragraph. We have a header or a title, a subtitle, and we have some text. And we're going to try to apply some of the design principles that Pat has mentioned along the way. So the first thing, which is super simple and we might know, is this concept of alignment. And we kind of have to go back and forth, right? So we take a look at the unaligned titles here, and we apply alignment, which basically means we're creating common edges. And that's already an improvement to this design. It's focusing the user. They feel comfortable looking at it. You feel more comfortable looking at it because things aren't all over the place. So that's a key principle. The second one is emphasis. Now there's a number of different ways to improve and to change emphasis in various elements. Can anybody see what happened in this particular case? Right. So this is maybe an H1. Right, for smart mapping, and here maybe this was an H3 or an H4. So, and we actually didn't change the color at all. It actually looks like the color is deeper, right, because there's more contrast because there's a larger surface. So, so size is one way to emphasize things on your page, and Pat gave us the example of the symbols too. You could do that with symbols as well. But it basically creates a better focal point. So hierarchy. Hierarchy can be emphasized in a number of different ways. You can use size, color, texture, and can anybody see what we did here just to create some sort of hierarchical representation? We basically, right, the color for the secondary title or the subtitle there is a little bit more gray, so we're de-emphasizing that a little bit. So we're really trying to get the user to read the title, and we're really trying to get that to call out on the page. So that's hierarchy. Another concept is consistency. So can anyone see what we did in this particular example? The font. So we went from sort of your Times version here, so it reads more like a newspaper, to more like a consistent font. So this is one consistent font throughout, and this font just makes it a little bit easier to digest. You're not looking for differentiation in between the header font and the paragraph. So it builds a stronger mental model for the user. And then here, white space. So white space is like my friend. It's one of the favorite things I like to do in applications because to me, it gives the user a chance to relax. It relaxes the eye. They can visually see that there's separation between things. They don't have to try as hard. So you'll see in a lot of well-designed web pages and web mapping apps, the use of white space can be very, very helpful. It just relaxes everyone, in my view anyways. And then this concept of balance. So let's say we wanted to add a button to this paragraph to really incentivize the user and create a call to action. Then we can do asymmetrical or symmetrical balance. So here we basically add the button to the opposite side of the title, and that creates a balance, and some people feel more comfortable with that. So this is like an optical equilibrium is what they call it. Now balance can be achieved in different ways. Right? It doesn't have to be horizontal alignment or vertical alignment. It could be asymmetrical or diagonal. So in this case, we achieve the same thing. The nice thing about this design is it encourages the user to scan all of the information before they actually get to the call to action. So you see they actually do two different things. And in this case, you might actually just try it out by reading the title and you're just sold. Here, hopefully, you might read more information. So there's different things, different ways to design things to help your user read and interpret what you're trying to get across. And the last principle here is this concept of unity. So all we've done is put a border right around this. And if we look at the difference from this sort of semi-transparent perforation to this solid line, the analogy here is kind of like how people are using cards now on the internet. Like cards are a really big thing. Like everything's in a card, right? And the reason for that is because conceptually people can digest what's in there and it feels like a package and they can read it and it feels digestible and people tend to consume it very easily. So this helps bring a design together. Something as simple as a border, it makes it feel like one, and this is the concept of unity. So this is a very, very simple design exercise I wanted to share with you. It's something that you can compare against the work that you're doing, whether you're building web pages or web applications, web mapping apps for that matter, but because the same principles apply everywhere. So that's on the slide deck, so hopefully that'll be helpful to you. Now let's focus specifically in the remainder of time on basically how to produce better mapping applications. Because it's ultimately, now we have at least a chunk of the theory behind us, we can move on to this. So being focused is critical. It's too easy with all of the knowledge that we have in this room to build a GIS application that's trying to do everything that GIS can do. And it goes back to the prototypes and the models and the problem that you're trying to solve and the questions that you're asking at the beginning of a project and the answers that you're getting. So more specific the better, more focused the better. Make it easy to accomplish the task. And then of course just keeping it simple. Some very, very simple basic rules to start from. Another set is considering when the application loads, what I call the blank state, what's often called in design as the blank state. It's like looking at the front of a textbook or the front of a newspaper. It's like, what is going to capture the user? What is the entry point? And is it clear? Do you want people to touch the map first or interact with the UI? And what happens when they touch the map? Does it require more interaction, or does it move to the UI? Does the interaction move to the UI? And then the thing to think about is the entry point the same for all users? Because it's recognized that to define one persona for an application is sometimes unrealistic. You have multiple personas. And different demographics use touch screens and visualization differently. There's a certain demographic that will tend to use the search, like a standard Google type search. There's another demographic that will actually touch the visualization they're looking at, like the map. Like everybody in the room here would probably jump to the map and start interacting with it. That's just because of who we are. But not everybody's like that. So these are really important things to basically define early on so you can help your user move from the blank state into the active state of the application. And then cartography. Of course, this we could spend a whole hour just talking, or probably a whole day talking about cartography, but just picking the right base map. And then the question of, do you even need a base map switcher? I counted this morning, I have almost 30 vector tiled base maps to start with. And then if you add the imagery ones in there too, we're up to about 50 different options for base maps now. So you need to pick the one that's going to obviously solve the problem that's at hand. So spend some time on that. Decide whether you even need a switcher. Decide whether you need to switch between 12 base maps at your disposal. If you're building something like the map viewer, that's going to help people build maps, and they might want to pick a base map, then that might be a case. But outside of that, probably aren't many cases. And then like the features that go on top of that, like is the symbology contrasting enough, like we were looking at earlier? Are the colors well defined? Are the sizes balanced? Do the colors of the features work with the rest of the color of the UI? So that's something to think about too. You can improve the visualization of an app, the unity of an app, by correlating the color contrast of the features, sometimes with some parts of the UI. The initial extent, how do you get back to the initial extent? You have to expect people are going to get lost sometimes in your application. So we call that the home button, right? There's other ways to do it as well. And like if you're building a strongly based geographic application, are coordinates and scale and legend really important? So these are things to think about. And only put the things on your mapping app that are required to help solve the problem. And then pop-ups, of course. Again, we could spend an hour on pop-ups alone, but here are the basics. Basically, to make them easy, intuitive to find. Like I said, not everybody's going to touch the application. Sometimes it's nice to have an application load and the pop-up is visibly there, pointing to the feature already ready to go, instead of forcing the user to find out that that's how you actually engage the application and make it work. You can use a panel as well. A pop-up, also can work as a panel depending on the integration and the workflow. And then is the pop-up part of the workflow? I think so many applications that I look at, the pop-up will appear, and then you don't know if that's the end of the road or not. Like generally there's a workflow involved. Am I looking for directions? Do I move from the pop-up to the interface that's beside the map and so forth? So there's often a disconnect between those. So I'm not going to say I'm anti-pop-up, but I'd like to see the workflow complete. So when I click on a button, if the pop-up occurs, I click on that, it goes to the next transaction. It's all part of one seamless workflow. So that's what I'm going to challenge you with when you build your applications. And then is the information and the data useful in the pop-up? I mean, too often we pick defaults, right? And the defaults are field names on the left and the values on the right. So we can do better than that, spend time making very informative pop-ups. And then even that, so even if we get all of that design right and all the principles right, there's still, is the user still happy? Was the application still useful? Well, performance is part of design. You can design the best application in the world, but if it's not performant, then your users aren't going to be happy. They might not be able to finish their workflow or get through, solve their problems. So does it load fast? How's the data querying and updating? What about touch reaction performance? I think this is one of the most critical things in mapping applications, because if you touch the application, it doesn't react in the right way in the right amount of time, then the user tends to touch it again, and then touch it again. And then internally with code, you have to handle that, right? So think about that and make sure you're testing touch and reaction time of your application to prevent these iterative events and use cases. And then indicate whether the map is busy is always a nice thing to do. If you have to do something that's a long load, let the user know, come up with a nice busy indicator that either, modals the screen so they can't move on to the next thing, or basically provide some information to let them know that something is happening. And the last thing is obviously usability and usability testing. And this is how we solve problems. Pat will admit to this in the office. We will be around a round table. We will all have ideas, and sometimes there's lots of exciting energy. And how we solve the problem is we go grab a human and we test the problem against them and say, hey, can you please try this? And in a very unbiased, neutral way. And then that helps us solve our problem as designers. So test with humans, the right humans, hopefully, people that are the same people that are going to be using your application in the field. Hopefully.
And that's how we do a lot of the testing on the developer website. When we tend to have disagreements, which happens all the time about what we want to design, we usually just tie break it by having someone go find 5 random other developers at whatever office they happen to be working at and show them the 2 designs. And that's usually, we get kind of a clear break from there. And it's finding the difficulty is really just finding people who are roughly like your users who don't really know anything about what you're asking them. If I go ask Al about a problem, Al's already biased on the design. He already has an opinion. And I can't ask anyone else on my team, but if I find someone else, like the person who works 3 offices down, who's just on the imagery team, they don't know enough about what we're working on to have a biased opinion. And you've got to kind of correct for that, but it really oftentimes is just as simple as go grab someone who doesn't know what you're working on and they can at least render you an opinion, and then you can use that to inform your decision.
So the point is, usability testing doesn't have to be always what you read it to be online in these heavy articles and so forth, where you have a room and there's people in it. You can just do quick ad hoc usability, and that could be worth just hours and hours of development and can improve your design like incredibly. So don't ever, discard that and the value that it can bring to your application development process. And then, when you do the testing, really focus on the user and see if they were able to accomplish their task. Like, every application allows you to solve a problem, whether it's driving directions or you're searching for a parcel or the value of a home or you're looking for the next, the oil deposit somewhere. It doesn't matter. If you can't accomplish the task, then basically the application design isn't really doing what it's supposed to do.
And the last thing on this is when we do usability testing, because we do it here on the developer site at Dev Summit, and we do it with the usability testing team, and they have a lot of good insights that we've kind of picked up. But the best one is the first time I ever sat in on a session, the guy who'd been doing it, who'd run sessions for 20 plus years, he says, don't listen to what people say when you're watching them interact with your application. They'll give you glowing reviews because that's how they don't want to disappoint you. Don't listen to what they say. Watch what they do. And we see this a lot on the developer side. Oh, this is so easy and great and blah, blah, blah. But really, they're just stumbling around for a few minutes trying to find whatever it is that we ask them to look for. So what they say doesn't always match up with what they're doing. And you actually have to really watch the interactions and try to see where are they pointing the mouse, ask people maybe what they're reading. It's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. And you can learn more by just watching people interact with your app than by asking them kind of what they want.
And I think the ultimate test is the workflow that you designed. Is that the workflow and the direction that they took when they used your application? And we stand up these web pages, even the new design, and to watch people interface with it, we're like, whoa, we didn't really think people were going to use it that way. So sometimes that's okay. Sometimes the design will still work. But if everyone's doing it a different way than the workflow that you prescribed and put in place, then it's time to look at the design again and maybe refinish it and redo it. And then, of course, was the application useful? And then ultimately, the most important thing in usability is, were the users happy? Do they walk away with a smile on their face? Or are they trying to delete that application as quickly as possible to go get the next one in the App Store? Because that's ultimately what's going to make the difference for you guys. Is you want people to come back and use that application again because this is a competitive world, it's a competitive environment, and of course, your application needs to be on top. So hopefully some of those guidelines will help you out. And I'll just finish up with a demo of some of the applications and some of the challenges and stuff that we faced along the way building the website and some of the demos into it. So we'll just work right through and we'll go to some of the applications. So we'll start with data visualization. So these are all different pages. They call them feature pages. So when this feature page loads, then what happens is the first top of the page is giving you like some data and some information. And let me make sure that, let's not get beyond the Renaissance guest. I think, there we go. This is going to help tremendously. I'm even surprised that the Renaissance Hotel connection worked in this location. Okay. So when the page loads, the top is giving us some basic information about visualization in ArcGIS. But then we have the mapping application that kind of creeps into the view. So it incentivizes people to come down. And we have a play button, which is a very logical kind of UI to use for a very wide demographic so that they can play this application. And we're rendering SVG in a very fast way here. So play is a very appropriate way to kick off this application and to incentivize people to use it. Let's go down a little further. We'll take a look at this 3D application. So we can borrow concepts that are tried and true on the web and carry those over to the design of our mapping applications. For example, just hover and focus, right? It's basically the rule when you're styling CSS, right? You always style the hover and focus so that you can incentivize the user and tell them there's something there to click on. Well, we can do that as well in our mapping applications. So do you see the correlation is basically the same? So that's what we did here, is we wanted to let the user know that you could touch these 3D objects. And when you touch them, we give them a small, very clear pop up with information that's very specific about the object that they touched. Now we have other metadata information on here. It's like our legend, right? And it's giving us more information, and it's optional. So if they find it distracting and want it out of the way, they can move it, but it's easy to appear, and it's giving them more information about the data and the geographic features that they're looking at. The lighter the green color, it's kind of the newer structures in the area. The darker blue is the 1900 to 1924. But it's very simple. We're not trying to overwhelm them with a lot of information, but there is some mapping UI that we wanted to present to the user here. So a couple interesting ideas there. Let's go here, take a look at what we did for directions. So again, when the page loads, you can see that it kind of looks cut off. The idea of that, it's just like the landing page of the developer site, is it incentivizes the user to inspect. Makes them curious. So there's all kinds of plays here. So we have this blue button that correlates to the blue route that we see. So we can do this thing called simple routing. Now, this went through like about 50 different designs because we really wanted to click on the application, let people put stops and barriers. And we really wanted to emphasize what you could do. And at the end of the day, for this particular purpose, for this demo application, it needed to be as simple as possible. So you can't get simpler than a single click button with a small call to action above. It says try generating both simple and optimized routes. And we kind of leave it a mystery as to what happens. So in one case, it generates a route that's 35 miles. Here it's 24.3 miles. And then what we do is we do the math for them here and let them know that it's actually 30% distance savings, depending on which type of operation that you use. So we're not making the user figure out the math between the two numbers and stuff. This is really simple stuff, but we're trying to really capture their attention and make it simple for them. Now this is highlighting the World Traffic Service. So, and that was a big push from the team. They wanted that we have this World Traffic Service, and we're like, all right, well, how do you represent that best in a web mapping app? I was like, well, let's use the world. Let's use 3D. So we start from that full extent of the world, then we zoom into a location, and then this is actually the search widget that I just restyled to look more like you would expect a search widget to look like outside of the map view. And then you'll notice when we touch it, we give the user a few options. So let's say, well, where else in the world? Well, they don't even have to type. They just need to click use their current location, and that's going to show them the traffic that we have available for them. In our case, it'll be Palm Springs here, to show them just what the traffic service looks like in their area of the world. Now, a more advanced user might go over and use this location button that we have off here to the side. Now, Pat was saying, at times it's good to cluster controls. At times it's still okay to separate controls because this is really secondary or tertiary thing. An advanced user might feel more comfortable using that control. So it's still okay to have two ways to accomplish the same thing. So we're building on some of the principles we learned earlier.
And this also brings in repetition a little bit too, because it can be tempting to just throw a single widget on a page and say it's done. We've allowed users to use their existing location. But taking that extra step, let's also, when a user clicks on search, let's put use my current location as the first option in search is a little bit extra work, but it also ensures that no matter where the user goes, because I might have been going there to just type in Palm Springs, or I might have been going in there to type in my house when I'm sitting at my house. I'm already at my house. How many times do we just open up a mapping application and say, yeah, whatever, search, use my current location, and instead of typing in where we are, I don't even know where we are, except for Palm Springs Convention Center, but I have no idea what the address is. I could search, but I know that adds another aspect to it, and it's an example of kind of using repetition to really drive home those workflows.
So, and you notice that I didn't have to do a lot. I didn't need to touch the map to make the application work. So that's interesting. Then we can look at the drive time scenario. So this one you've seen on the big stage today too, but here's some of the design concepts behind it, is that there's no submit button. So, and it reads just like somebody would read through it. So they'll read about the service, it says try calculating drive times, and it says show me so we can change this from 25 to 20 minute drive area. Or we can click on this thing and change it to a walk area. So somebody that doesn't know anything about this is a very complicated service, and we use a lot of big words to describe this. This is showing you how you can read through using the controls. So it's stepping them through using language. So there's a lot of sort of hidden design in this application, and you can steal and borrow these different concepts for your apps too. So here again, we can just go to different places around. And what we do, and you can have fun doing this, is there's an Easter egg in each one of these apps. So, and some of them are just very discrete and small. This one is if you just slide the map, it's going to automatically recalculate your walking or drive time for you. And again, this could be for the more inquisitive, the more advanced user who actually touches the map. And in most of these cases, you see I'm not interacting with the map directly. Okay, so the usability is attempting and trying to be super high. Last example. We'll take a look at demographics. So this is demographics and some of the stuff we do there. This guy. Let's go down to this one. Okay, so a few things happened there. You notice when I put the application into view that the legend appeared. So the legend wasn't there originally, so that attracts you to the map. So you look at the map and say, So a user in this case, because all we're doing is switching between the different types of demographic layers here that are available and different maps that are available, we're tracking you to the map. We could do more here to incentivize them to touch the map, but if we start, the colors were so prominent that there's a large draw to touch the map and interact with it. So, and this is an interesting concept where this is actually a pop-up, and it's showing us the name of this particular demographic area, and it's giving us a little chart like you've seen before, I'm sure. But we really wanted to show the legend on here as well, but we didn't have the real estate. But if you come back and click on the legend, we actually reuse the pop-up. This is actually the pop-up with the legend control in it. And if you want to learn more about how to do this, come to my other design session with the JavaScript API, and we'll show you the code on how to do this. But so this was an interesting design concept where we're reusing a UI element, in this case a panel, which is a pop-up, to serve both purposes. The single-click pop-up, display, and then an easy way to get back to the legend. So a little tip and trick there for sure. And again, when you come into display here, you'll see the legend appears on the map. Again, these are just small visuals that change the focus of the user from they might be reading through this enrich your own data section, but whoa, suddenly the map's alive. Oh, I can touch this. And something I want to share here was how we emphasize the selected feature. If there's one thing I can share with you and you can take away today is that always show the selected feature. Don't ever let a user select on a feature and not show that it's activated in some way. Okay, it's the basic rule that we expect when we're using web apps, right? I showed you earlier for the hover states. Just like here, we can see that this is the active state. It's highlighted in some way. I don't care what color you use. I don't care how you do it. You can borrow from these ideas or you can use it your own. But this synchronizes the two pieces of data, the geographic data with the fields and the values that are available. So we could move through these different types, and you can see how we use different base maps here to either contrast or complement some of the colors that are used as well. But we still have that high contrast and connection between the highlighted feature and the data that's associated with it. And then one of my favorite ones is Colorado Winter Sports Expenditures. So we actually had to create all of these maps, right? So then I live in Colorado, so I was like, well, what can we do? Where can we see where people are spending money? So we generated this one as well. So that's just a few highlights of some of these design principles in action, because we really wanted to show you, how we implemented them and how we tried to do that on the dev site. And yeah, hopefully bringing these principles together, going through that little design exercise just with the paragraph, give you some ideas on how you can improve the designs of your applications. And don't forget bit.ly, 2CD, F, V3B. You get that really quick, or take a picture.
We'll leave that up.
Then you can get all the slides. You can get links to everything that we had here. And I got a few other sessions coming up on design, so check those out. Another one tomorrow and another one on Thursday. So come on down, and if anybody has any questions, or Pat, if you have anything else to add.
No, I think that's good. Thank you.
Thank you.